Our sketch for today, we're doing this rhythmically in the chronological order. So that's why Unity Temple is first up. I think people, if they talked about his work, you talk more about the period before you start to talk about the Unity, but that's where we are now. So here is our view shed of the temple in 1905 and completed by 1908. So we're looking from the parking lot side because the street side has got a lot of vegetation and changes over the years. This is actually a cleaner image of the site that we're going to draw it from. What's nice about it, the building itself is cubic, so we're going to start with that language and get it correct, and then build all the other planes that'll fall off it to the left and right, north and south on the site. So we want to establish in all of our views, you can find great sensational drone pictures, you can find odd angles and stuff, but I really like to have them drawn as if you're on the site and you're walking up to it. So we want to be able to see this primary aspect facing east, the northern elevation less, that faces the town on the local road there. And then we're going to move from the primary space, so the ecclesiastical center, the spiritual part, down to the community center here, that's linked together by a little breezeway, much after the religious parody you see in Japanese temples over the years, when they take temples down and rebuild them every 20 years. This is a typical type of setting between the A and B by a C unit, a narthex that connects the two together. So what we're going to work on then, I'll come back to the model periodically as we go. I'll hold it up here in my left hand, is we simply want to find that horizon line. And so the tick marks kind of show you that if you came off of some of the horizontals I've articulated up here, you'll see that left vanishing point is coming off the page, and the right vanishing point, which is much closer to us, is driving down much quicker. So they're both off the page to the right and left on 11 by 17, but now the bottom where the parking lot ends is beneath the horizon line. So we know those two are going to come to a point, and these two are coming to the point, and they're going to be organized by somebody 6 feet tall with a camera on this site. So all the way across here, absolutely parallel with the top and bottom of the page, is the horizon line. So our first job is to grab the 5-fold openings here and drop that box down to ground and to its top, and the plane up above, which will protect that box in its day, and then the zones that we find on either side of this box, the pure cube, just like this was, we drew a second ago. And then when it comes to the corner of the plate that returns, and I've drawn that here, and then this one's going to turn, this is going to vanish back to the opposite point, which is on the horizon line. So somewhere between this line and that line, you're going to vanish that back. And then here, it'll be parallel to that, and then I'll come back to. We have a little bit of a bump out for the skylighting above the main space, which elongates the square into a rectangle. And we see one corner of that, but from this view, it dies back into this. We don't see it popping up beyond that. This comes down beneath the eye height of somebody standing next to it, and it's got a little bit of a base material that projects out as if it's got the feet of the cube being protected. And now that's going to rise from this corner back to this point off the page. So the reason why this is so sort of epic too is that it was almost a budget issue that made Wright become more creative than he naturally was in the prairie idea, because those wealthy people had a lot of money to spend on some opulent materials. Here was a congregation that they lost their building in a fire. And when they came back to build it, the budget, believe it or not, back in the day was $45,000, which is pretty modest. Even if you use that with inflation of what it would be today, you probably couldn't build this today. But Wright used what was probably the only material he could probably do to build it for the budget he wanted to, and that was that single aesthetic change of the modern movement of reinforced concrete. So a lot of people historically, at this type of scale, consider this to be the first modern building in the world. That's why it's on this UNESCO site, even though it's still spectacular, even if it wasn't the first, because it was innovating with the material of the 20th century. They still call it a modern building, even though it's really within this Art Nouveau realm, because they hadn't talked about modern architecture as an actual field of history. Because really the word modern is Tuesday at 4 o'clock, anytime in history, that's modern architecture with a small m. Modern with a capital M is actually a stylistic period in the 20th century. And Wright's part of that before it begins. Again, that great anomaly there. So we'll come down to the other wing here and find the same type of patterns there, where there's an initial movement of pieces that fly up and a return down the corner that comes over on the side. And some of the pieces that you might see in the distance as the cube completes itself are going to be out of our vantage point because we are so low compared to the height of the building. As I tilt this up, they fall out of view. Okay. So at this point, at the base of the cube here, coming from that left vanishing point, there's a piece that projects out, and it's the access point from the parking garage to that main court to a certain height, which is almost a little bit taller than eye height, and then comes back. So we'll run this piece back. And that'll be the base of the community center on the back side. And there are 4 zones for the openings for the community center back there, with its pop out on top. And that moves all the way across the site because this is a rectangle in plan. So it's got kitchen areas on one side and more congregation areas. And so it's breakout rooms for the children, for benefits, for things before and after the ceremonies. Okay, what we can do right away then is turn to some of the detail to show some of the massing. So each of these elements up top here are actually piers that rush up that height. So 6 piers given the 5 spaces. And then beyond them in terms of the depth, as they go back before they meet the wall behind them. So there is a little bit of almost like a porch that's made out of those elements there. And we'll double up that size as it floats over that porch. And much like the base here, there's a base of those piers that rise up. And they'll turn the corner briefly here as this does, as you see here by this column, to this point. And then this insets as a plane before this corner pier takes over. So coming about this height on either side, right across this whole element, there are 2 major piers that block down. So there's a square inscribed in a larger square. And so these piers will come out and then drop down to the corner. Now, as they run around, the images on the side reflect all 4 sides of this. It's broken up by the atrium that connects here, but it's meant to be an entirety as this thing's in the round, even though it's a square form. But the issue in terms of how it's nature is used is that on the street side, to buffer the sobriety of this reinforced wall, some of the writers in Chicago called it a Mayan courtyard when it was first built, because people didn't see reinforced concrete just as the actual decorative element itself. So what they did was they planted more of opulent trees on this edge. So this is what we'll use, a technique that Wright does for the languages architecture. We'll use that to frame the sketch and the drawing itself. So as the top of the square tower up top comes by and has its return, it's going to meet, instead of seeing the corner of the building, it's going to be met by the language of the architecture of nature herself. So we'll start with just some lines here, which is going to allow us to have the sketch move off the page in perspective, but blunt our eye. Because the only thing you don't want to do is have the end of a perspective come close to the edge of a piece of paper. So we're going to sort of waffle in, not as a subject, this is an idea of vegetation that'll come down to eye height so we can see beneath it, so we can see some ideas of the grade down below. But that'll be secondary information because it's around the corner. So this happens on this side, so we can simply carry this over at the same height and then run that line down. And then popping out from that corner, once we get around the pier here, are 5 openings. And they're going to be more compressed in terms of how we see them on the end of the building, rotating around, and a very large projection of a roof line that'll run that way too. On this side of the community, it's going to actually wrap around too, as the boxes keep enforcing the idea of a volume, repeating the volume adjacent to it. And then right on the corner, as you make your entry, whether from this side of the parking lot or the street on the other side, there's actually a nice detailed type of parapeted plant hanging where the planes then project off from that corner and create a vessel there. They have vegetation on top of that and then setting down on the plinth of that corner pier. Okay, so now we're at a point where since the perspective of the boxes are kind of achieved, the next thing that's going to help us move through this is to move the pattern of light. And so that will be more from a photographic view rather than the model, because things get washed out very quickly by holding this here. So I'll keep it as a reference, but it's not going to match what the model is. It's going to match more of what it'd be if you were there on an early morning in the summer and the light's coming in from the east. So what we're going to do is make sure on the north side it doesn't receive light. We're going to come up to this whole zone up here, and we'll put its little band on the top. And we're going to make this whole edge of our skin in shade. So we're going to wash that over there to make sure we kind of identified that as the principle of that being darker. And now this piece is going to come over a longer projection here and have that underside is darker. And now the whole north side gets a wash as well. Side of that, and then these two face north as well too. And the one side of this goes back is gray. And the edge above is grayed out. Now the fascia, which faces directly east, is brilliantly lit by the sun, but its underside, the projection of the eave, is a wash of dark. And now that comes down a certain distance on all of our piers here and then stops. So that'll be a cast shadow. It'll come back in maybe a little bit darker later. And then obviously the windows that are between these elements, here's the other side of all these piers. But the windows come down about halfway to light the congregational space on the inside, but not provide views out to anything in the area. So everything's happening down here in the lower 2/3. So there's no direct distraction like somebody's giving a sermon where you'd be looking outside. So it's a very controlled environment inside, almost you consider like a geode, a very crusty rock formation on the inside, but a beautiful sparkly space on the inside. Now here's the thing about windows is that we can wash all the stuff that's not receiving light, that's architecture. Windows people tend to think are going to be bright because they're lit up. But in the daytime, even with lights on, there's still a dark space. And that's what helped us kind of achieve that idea of it being dark by coming in and doing the darkest yet we've had to show that being inside away from the sunlight. So a darker volume. And then coming down from where the sun casts a shadow onto these piers, it'll come down an angle on all of its sides. So we can also make those a little bit darker as well. And so that kind of animates the top of that box and shows the frailty of light as it kind of moves across the space. So we'll come over here, and this is all in southern light, so that's a good exposure. This wall actually comes around so we see one side of it. There's just a line break between construction there The edge of our piece here doesn't have light on this side or the wall we're walking by. But then the wall does, at the angle the sun comes down, it does cast a shadow on that part of the building back over here. And then throws it a little bit as the sun is still early morning onto the base at this point. Now, around this point, we've got all of this now, the community center back into this area, which is broken up by a couple of volumes. That's all in dark tone. So once you get past this wall, we simply wash that out. Make sure you keep the white of this entry planter nice and light. And the top rectangular volume that caps the community space also has nice value to it. So now, just like we did with the cube here, we've assigned value to these, and it seems like it clarifies the massing on the space here. We have to go back and repeat how these three piers create the 4 spaces for windows here by, first of all, articulating the pier themselves is a little broader. But then going between them and showing a little sliver of something much darker between those, which would be the interior of the space inside the community space. And that little bit will help kind of rectify that, of showing it as being inside, not outside space. Now, just like this projects the shadow cast on here, this projecting roof also comes down a certain distance on the community center. So we wash over there. This wall will keep nice and bright. And then again, to shield this white, like we're going to have this dark next to this darker dark here, we're going to come in and put one of the backyard on the lot trees kind of adjacent to it. Again, just the design of a generic tree next to it. Doesn't have to be a typology because it's not a subject. And we'll wash that as a tone right up to the edge of the white here, and then we'll pull that cube off the back. So now we can come back to the trees here, and they might be brighter at the top with the summer sun striking, but at the bottom they won't. So we'll put a dark here and run that right up to the edge of the building, and then beyond in the heights of the skies, beyond it. So those are all our steps that we sort of talked about so far. So as we kind of wrap this up, because we're getting close to 7 o'clock, now it's a matter of just going back and sort of enhancing what you've done so far, because really in terms of the scale and scope of this, we kind of just did a skeleton for it, then we washed it with tone, then we detailed a bit. We're going to do those exact same steps of detailing and more tone now, just to pull out more things that we want to express on the site. So one of the things we can do right away is to create that ground plane, which this has got a base to it. And so this part of the parking lot ends, and that's more of a walkway, so that helps out there. The language of this is just a flat plane with parking lines to it, which is very interesting, just adjacent to it, but it does have a tone to it. So I'd like to come up to this line and then start to bring a nice wash of tone that comes and has the white sit on top of it. So again, you're not doing the point of your pencil, you're kind of doing an oblong shape that gets chamfered off as you wash this back and forth, and let that come all the way over the right of the sketch. And then even to the point where near the base of the building, you want to have the lawn there be darker too, so it sits on a nice, tight, dark ground plane. So now we've got the weight of all this reinforced concrete kind of plunking down and then coming out perpendicular towards us. So maybe to help the line work, we'll come from the building and just do a couple of horizontal lines to go all the way back to that right vanishing point, which will help set this down as a horizontal plane. And then maybe come back in and wash to one point more heavy than the others, kind of nuance it a little bit. At this point, since it is more of a walkway, you can actually have concrete construction joints there to kind of give the way. And I think we've done enough in terms of placement of where our values are. There is a 5 or 6 story residential way behind it, but that's our prejudice. We can leave that out of the sketch here now because it wasn't there when Wright built this. So what we'll do now is just go back in and move ourselves toward that language of the black. So we've got all our white we want. It's really, the sun's doing a great job here. There's a little bit of a sliver of light for a window, vertical window that comes at the joints between the exploded square around the central square. That'd be nice to pick up. There is a detail here where this piece ends and then this butts out and comes down a little. So we could probably call out that one again to get the shape modulate more. And then we'll double up on this dark a little bit. You don't want to wash out all the white there because even though it's on a shade side, you want to have some highlights in the shade. So considering that, wherever planes in space meet, you go back into that edge, and you make it darkest right where they meet and then fan back. Darkest where it meets and kind of fan back. So that now that white's more prominent at the most important part of the sketch, which is right where the corner turns here and it goes on the north face. So it's got to be darkest right here where it's against the sky, even though it's a white piece. And it goes to white. Underneath, it's darker right at the edge by the sky, and then it can become a little bit lighter, and then maybe darker over here on this edge. Now we go to the window area, and I did sort of a dark gray there, but now we want to put jet black in there, but not in the same spot. We want to animate that and put some highlights of just splotches of dark that show that stained glass and light does different things and bounces around inside these windows. And that way kind of intrigues us more in terms of looking at the detail of the space as we move back into it. Over on this piece, this is going to cut over to this edge of the house, or the community space, and then to the backyard where the vegetation is. And then right where that meets, we'll make that a darker edge to kind of end the building. It's got its trim piece at the base there. That'll go back. So we know that obviously this is our subject because that's the main ecclesiastical space. This is secondary, but we still want to sort of end that sketch there so the idea doesn't fall off the page. So this is a key corner because this ends the main building. And so we want to make that edge be prominent to get around this little short wall. We want to make that prominent. The underside of this, even though it's a cavity, it's not receiving any light. So that's actually fairly dark beneath the planting there. And that vegetation is going to be darker than the architecture. So we'll finish with that. Maybe turning the corner right going to north on this plinth on the edge. Here that drives down to the ground could be more animated. The base of the tree, maybe as it kisses the building, you could define a couple more of the actual leaves on it to give some quality to that tree, because that's the only really subject tree that's that close to the building. So that might warrant a little bit of detail there. And we're getting close. And then maybe to have that one last sharpened pencil, I have this a nice tip to it, kind of really get that nice edge at the top. Clean up that piece again. And now we are officially on our way to learning about Wright through these great international historical sites. So I will shortly close out the film and then post it to OneDrive later tonight or tomorrow morning. So you can do a repeat there for those who couldn't make it, look at the exact same information a day later.